Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Smart Tech 247 webinar series, Securing the Season. So far this season, we've covered manufacturing and transport, and delighted to be back here today focused on technology. And I'm joined by Ed Burke, who's the technology lead at Smart Tech 247. Also, thanks to IBM, Verizon, Google for providing background information for our discussion today. Hey, Ed, listen, great to spend the time here with you chatting about this. Thank you. And honestly, it's really hard to know where to start with cybersecurity in the tech industry. With defender and adversary use of AI is just growing and growing. We see cybercrime is becoming a real global threat, particularly as both IT and now OT systems are connected in the connected world. And we continue to see cyber operation by nation state actors. And like on top of that, it's changing. The nature of attacks is changing. We're seeing an eightfold increase in the number of actual breaches where edge devices were targeted. That's really a big difference year over year. Ransomware is also showing significant growth. And also, and I know you're going to talk about this, ransomware is also disproportionately affecting smaller organizations, which is something a lot of our guests really need to be aware of. So combine this environment with the technology sector where the need for speed, scale, and that trust contract you have with your customers, that provides a really challenging dynamic in the current climate. So it's Smart Tech Edge. We're seeing unprecedented interest in cybersecurity from tech companies. So maybe, Ed, if I can ask you briefly just to kind of introduce yourself and maybe kick us off with, what are the key drivers that you're seeing with your customers today from a cybersecurity perspective?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for your time today, Gavin, and everyone that's joined the webinar. At Smart Tech 247, we work with a whole range of technology companies, ranging from tiny startups that we partner with them on their journeys as they grow from little startups and scale globally to working with many multinational technology organizations as well. And this is an area that I'm particularly passionate about, as I come from a startup background. I have my own startup, and I've worked with a lot of technology startups prior to joining Smart Tech. So I'm acutely aware of the need for speed in the technology sector as startups scale and grow, and also the resource constraints that startups in particular are under. And sometimes, unfortunately, this can lead to security perhaps being left as an afterthought. But what I want to really emphasize today is that security should be embedded from day one. It's really critical, and by embedding it from day one, it will save you a lot of headaches down the line. It will save you a lot of money, and critically, it will enable you to build trust with your partners and your customers, which is what you need while you're scaling.
Yeah, super. Thanks, Ed. And as we kind of chatted about earlier, supply chain is critical. And I know that the Smart Tech team are working with some of our larger customers on helping them manage their supply chain, and we're also advising a lot of companies who are selling into the B2B sector on how to actually manage the supply chain expectations of their customers. How are you seeing this impacting the technology sector today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, supply chain is is absolutely critical, and we're seeing according to Verizon's 2025 report, 30% of breaches involved a third party. So it's absolutely critical. But before maybe jumping into the supply chain, I thought I might also just give you a brief overview of some of the key risks that we are seeing, and key drivers that we are seeing in the market today.
Yeah.
And one of those key drivers, which we might consider when we're thinking about why now, is AI. 16% of all breaches involved attackers using AI, according to IBM's 2025 report. So we're seeing a proliferation of AI, and this is enabling threat actors that maybe weren't as resourced as some of the nation state actors or more significant threat actors scale attacks, and this is a significant threat to startups and SME companies. Another thing that I'd like to briefly mention as well is the risk profile of SME companies. There are 4 times the number of SME victims than there are large organizations, according to Verizon's 2025 report. So it shows that SMEs and startups and scale-ups are a key sector at risk. And just to go back to your ransomware report comment there, a minute ago, Gavin, 88% of breaches involve ransomware. So one might traditionally think that ransomware threat actors might be more interested in large organizations because obviously large organizations have a lot more money. But the evidence is showing that we're seeing the prevalence of that to a much higher degree in smaller organizations. And perhaps that's because smaller organizations might be viewed as maybe having lower hanging fruit. And it also shows that these threat actors are perfectly prepared to change their demands in terms of a ransomware, so they'll ask for a smaller figure from a smaller company, and that doesn't bother them so much. They're still perfectly prepared to go after them, and this is all enabled as well by by AI. And another key that we're seeing that's driving customers towards us, and I'll come to the supply chain now in a minute, but it is kind of regulatory drivers. And what I mean by regulatory drivers is we've got regulations like DORA and NIS2, which impose regulations directly on organizations, and they also impose obligations indirectly on organizations such as the supply chain partners. So what we see at SmartTech with many of our large clients, so we're working with clients in regulated industries, major international organizations, pharma companies, automotive companies, is that supply chain security is an absolute priority for them. And we are carrying out cybersecurity audits for them on a regular basis. So if you're a technology company or a startup company, and even if you're not directly regulated, you're going to it's a very good idea to consider complying with standards like ISO 27001 so that you can meet the requirements that your customers will have in order to be able to do business with them. And I might just mention just one of our customers, which I think is quite relevant to scaling companies. So one of our customers is a scaling technology company, scaling around the world. And for anybody that's been in enterprise sales, you know that these sales can take, anything from 6 months to a year or even beyond. You really have to fight to, win those deals in these early stage companies. And with this particular client, they had gone through the entire sales cycle, and then in the contract at the very end, it came up that they needed to be SOC 2 compliant, and it was a condition to closing. And that can cause a significant problem for companies if they're not prepared. In this particular instance, the customer had time to implement the standard, but for lots of technology companies and startup companies, if you don't have a robust security posture, there's controls and procedures in place, and if you can evidence that by an ISO certification or compliance with SOC 2, that is really, really critical for closing deals and not stalling, or at worst losing the deal. So those are some of the kind of key drivers that I'd like to mention. You mentioned supply chain drivers as well. I mentioned the Verizon report, where 30% of breaches involved a third party, but it's not just us cybersecurity folks and technology professionals that are seeing this. We're seeing this in the news every day. Reports of breaches in the supply chain. my parents who wouldn't be very familiar with cybersecurity are listening to it on the news, on the radio. It's everywhere. And a recent example would be the Dublin Airport Authority breach, and that was where actually one of their suppliers, Collins Aerospace, was breached, not Dublin Airport themselves, and passenger details were leaked onto the internet, up to 3.8 million passenger details relating to boarding passes. So we're seeing it, everywhere, which really kind of emphasizes how important this supply chain security is. And then as well, we're seeing it with AI as well. Like a lot of the AI attacks that are rising are actually directly related to SaaS software providers providing AI services. So 29% of all AI related breaches came from third-party SaaS providers providing AI services. And then just to circle back to NIS2, as I was mentioning earlier on, NIS2 directly affects companies. It could, from digital infrastructure companies, online marketplaces, and there is a range of listed entities in the NIS2 directive. But it can also indirectly affect suppliers because there are very strict requirements on the companies that fall within NIS2 with regard to their suppliers, which is very important for technology companies to be aware of those requirements.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Get it, Ed. Thank you. So really the key message here from what you're saying is that you need to be aware of your customers' requirements from a cyber risk perspective, and that could be driven by regulation, it could be driven by previous experience, what have you. But that awareness is key as part of any engagement cycle with your potential customers. Thank you. But speaking of risks, are there particular risks that you want to highlight today that you talking to our audience, say, listen, folks, these are three things you got to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of technology companies, just a couple of key risks that I'd like to highlight is the insider threat, and we can't avoid it, but AI risks as well. It's really important to have policies and procedures in place with regard to AI. In terms of insider risks, so 9% of breaches across all organizations, according to IBM, came from insider risks. So putting in places policies, procedures, network segmentation related to that can be very helpful. But it's also important to emphasize how insider risks aren't just malicious insider risks. They can also be, mistakes that insiders make. And we see that
Absolutely.
absolutely. And we see that quite commonly in technology companies, particularly ones that are scaling, because you've got to remember in the early days, it might just be a small group of people, the founding team. They have access to everything, and they mightn't have put in place formal procedures. Very quickly, the startup can can start onboarding lots of customers, can raise a very significant amount of funding, and suddenly they've gone from 10 to 50 or 100 employees. And then we can see things like employees making mistakes arising. So, for example, we have a customer, and that particular customer, one of their developers wanted to work on some code at home over the weekend. So they attempted to upload the code to their personal GitHub repository. Fortunately, they were working with SmartTech, which provides, we have a 24/7 managed detection and response service, and our MDR platform was able to, pick that up and stop that. So the data didn't end up going outside of the organization. And it's really, really critical to bear that in mind, because employees can make mistakes. And the last thing you want is for your code to be outside of the organization, are not under your control. So it's really important to consider that the mistakes people can make as well, which is mitigated by putting in controls and policies.
It's superb. Thanks, Ed. Appreciate the update there. So you mentioned NIS2 earlier on. What other regulations should the tech companies listening on the webinar today should they be aware of or conscious of as they're growing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of regulations. I suppose NIS2 is a key one, but also the Digital Operation Resilience Act is really important, and it imposes very stringent cybersecurity and information security requirements under entities that fall within its scope, which is largely regulated entities, financial institutions, and those types of entities, and that can impact fintech businesses if they fall within a scope. But it can also, indirectly again affect software technology companies in general, because under NIS2, uh, critical ICT suppliers are regulated. So if you are a critical ICT supplier, there are strict requirements that will apply directly to you. So you'd have to consider that, and that may become more important as you're scaling and if you're starting to do businesses with banks and financial institutions, or you may just be an ICT supplier. While it's not directly regulated under DORA, DORA would require entities in scope to impose quite strict requirements on their suppliers.
Oh, super. Thanks, Ed. So one of the things I know that you and I were chatting about earlier on was also owner demands, right? We're seeing lots of we're having lots of conversations with customers and prospects where the owners are really challenging them from a cyber risk perspective. What are you hearing there in the tech sector?
By owners, are you referring to investors?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really good point, Gavin. So what we're seeing there in the tech sector as well is um, VCs want to see that their portfolio companies have a robust security posture. So it's, as I was saying earlier on, it's compliance is a must-have, not just from the customer's perspective, which I was mentioning, but also from the owners, because if you don't have a robust security posture, it also implies a certain naivety as well, because it's going to slow down your growth journey. It perhaps might indicate you're not taking security very seriously in a world where security is absolutely paramount. So that's something that a lot of VCs would want to see, and we can help startups and scale-ups in that respect in terms of implementing information security system managements like ISO 27001, doing pen testing and helping them put in place those policies and procedures so that customers and indeed owners and investors can have the confidence in those businesses.
No, absolutely. And yeah, just to kind of build on that also. So we're from a tech perspective, you got to have the controls in place, right? You've got to make sure those controls are effective and they're working, right? They're the right controls given the risk you face. And that the controls are actually working. And definitely companies like SmartTech 247 help a lot there because they monitor the controls and tell you the effectiveness against your risk and all that kind of stuff. And then you have to be able to demonstrate those controls, right? Using standards like, achieving certification for 27001 or alignment to NIST. But the other angle, and you make a really good point, is for your investors, you got to be able to tell them the story. What the investors they're probably not going to ask you about 27001. They're going to ask you, how are you fixed against ransomware attacks? How are you
Yeah,
fixed against insider threat?
yeah,
What's your AI policy? So there's a big onus on IT leadership and cybersecurity leadership in companies to be able to demonstrate that to their investors. And another area that at SmartTech we do a lot of work on. Brilliant, super stuff, Ed. Thank you very much. So Ed, we're coming to the end of the chat here. So if you think about quick fire, three high priority recommendations that you have for our audience today, right? If they're to leave the call, what do you want them really thinking about in terms of how they're thinking about their cybersecurity posture?
yeah. I mean, first of all, I would, they should have the foundations in place. That's absolutely critical. Um, There is an Enterprise Ireland cybersecurity grant as well that can help you do a cybersecurity review. So we'll
Oh
be
yeah.
looking at doing your cybersecurity review and getting those foundations in place. And I would be looking at putting in place, getting aligned with ISO 27001 at a very early stage. That is pretty key. I would also, it's really important to implement identity controls such as MFA and least privilege from the earliest days, from day one. It's relatively easy to do, but you want to do it quickly. And then just to kind of circle back to what you were saying there, when you've got all of these controls in place, you want to be able to monitor and detect the controls, and you want to be able to and detect threats, and you want to be able to ensure that these controls are working. So Smart Tech can help with that with our MDR 24/7 managed detection and response service.
Super, Ed. So have the basics in place, be
Yeah.
able to demonstrate you got the basics in place through certifications, et cetera, et cetera. Identity, we're seeing identity is a huge attack vector today, especially with the increased use of AI and phishing. Yeah, so definitely really, really important there. And and just making sure that you understand the effectiveness of those controls,
Absolutely.
and given your
Absolutely.
threat environment. Super. No, really, thanks that. So hey, listen, thanks for your time today. Everybody, the seasonal security, well, that's going to continue over the next few weeks. Please watch out. Also, please think about Zero Day Con. We're back next year, 29th of April. So looking forward to seeing everybody there. And make sure to get access to your early bird tickets. And thank you everybody for the attendance and listening to us today. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks a million. Thank you. Bye bye.